Good evening, everyone. Good evening. It's good to be back. I think Supper Club I spoke at maybe a year ago. I'm not sure about that. But I'm going to be talking about allergies tonight. It's very, very common. And where allergies are probably first noticed would be a child having eczema or a child having asthma. Most people don't realise that eczema and asthma are both allergies. So the million-dollar question is, what is it an allergy to? The most common allergens are wheat, dairy and refined sugar. Dairy milk is excellent milk for baby calves. Got that? Baby calves. And if you give a newborn baby calf the milk in the supermarket, did you know that calf will die? Now it is true that some people have in their heritage dairy. So if you've got a 5th or 6th generation dairy farmers, they usually can handle a little dairy, but the dairy they can handle is the raw milk straight from the cow. But the milk from the supermarket, I don't know whether anyone can really handle that because it has been altered. And the reason pasteurisation happened really was because of dirty dairies. My daughter lives in Wisconsin and she lives opposite a dairy farm, and she said the dairy's not very clean. And what happens is, if you go, it's a bad smell, and they put those things on the udders, you know, to get the milk out, and sometimes the udders would fall on the floor and there's manure on the floor and they just put them on the next udder. Eventually, after about 10 years, they did test the milk and found E. coli in the milk, and the dairy was closed down. Down the road, there's another dairy and it's spotlessly clean. You could actually eat off the floor in the dairy. It is so clean. And yet when the milk truck picks up the milk, what happens? It all gets thrown in together. My friend is she lives in Africa, and she has her and her husband have an orphanage, and they have a couple of hundred orphans, and they started getting babies because a lot of parents died, a lot of mothers died from AIDS, and they found that the babies went well on the soy milk. But there was a group of babies that were not doing well, and it was the Maasai babies. Because what do the Maasai eat? The Maasai eat, they eat corn, but they also eat a lot of meat and milk and blood. And the lady said, I don't know what I'm going to do with these babies. And her husband saying, I'm getting a cow. They got the cow, they milked the cow, they gave the cow's milk to the baby Maasais, and they flourished. Because the Maasai have in their gut enzymes that break down the dairy because they've been eating it for thousands of years. I don't think I have enzymes to break down dairy in my gut. Because when I was a little girl, I grew up in a typical Australian home. I'm 5th generation Australian, Scottish descent, and we just ate sausages, mashed potato, peas or chops every night of the week, except for Sunday. Their mum would cook the roast lamb, and we just had cereal and milk for breakfast, and that was the average, well, it still is the average Aussie diet. And when I went to school, in our mid-morning break, we all had to drink a bottle of milk. I don't know if that happened in America. So this would be in the 60s, Oh, I felt ill all morning after drinking that milk. I can't handle milk. In fact, the current figures in Australia are 60% of people can't handle the dairy milk. Now, there is a reason for that, and as I mentioned, it is in the heritage. Some who are dairy farmers for centuries do have those enzymes to break it down. But what has been found is, if, let's take me who can't handle the dairy, let's say I'm drinking a lot of cow's milk because my mother says it's good for me and it's going to build my bones, and I'll have a look at that in a minute too, but I'm feeling ill. What's happening when it gets into my gut? It's not being broken down properly, so it breaks down to a molecule, let's say, that looks like that. It gets into the blood and the blood sees it as a pathogen, meaning it doesn't recognize it, so it creates antibodies. And these antibodies come along and consume what they see as the enemy. Nothing wrong with that, the body does that. But then these antibodies, because I'm trying not to drink much milk because I can't handle it, they look over and they see my pancreas. And my beta cells in my pancreas, sorry, I'll do this correctly, my beta cells in my pancreas are the same shape. So these antibodies that were created to clean up those molecules because I couldn't break down milk, they come along and what do they start consuming? My beta cells in my pancreas. In fact, the current figures are 70% of children that have cow's milk in the first year of life can develop type 1 diabetes. So that's a well-known fact, and in the book China Study, Dr. Colin Campbell, he quotes some of that research, so you can check that out. But what about the eczema and what about the asthma? See, when a body cannot handle the cow's milk, one of the ways the body reacts is creates a lot of mucus. And it creates a lot of mucus in the eustachian tubes. And are you familiar with your eustachian tubes? They connect your ears and your mouth and your nose and your eyes. So a lot of mucus is created there, and then congestion builds up in the chest. There's your asthma. These are the children that have to have their adenoids out, their tonsils out. Do you know what your tonsils are? They're the watchmen at the gate. They're just saying, hey, there's a problem. Oh, we'll just take out the watchmen of the gate. We're sick of their loud cries. Now, what's going to tell the body that there's a problem now? You see that? Now, what unfortunately is not often addressed in medicine is this. Why are the adenoids swelling? Why does the asthma keep returning? Why are the tonsils swelling? I get a few emails, Barbara, what can we do for tonsillitis? So I say to them, the first thing is you must stop the dairy and the wheat and the refined sugar. But a word of warning here, it can take up to 2 months before the full effects of stopping it are seen. So a person can eat a slice of bread and it'll be out of the body in 24 hours, but the effect can remain for up to 2 months. One lady said, aha, she said, I stopped for 2 weeks. I didn't see any difference. So she said, I started up again. And one lady said, well, I stopped the dairy. That didn't seem to make a difference. So I went back on that and stopped the wheat. So it all has to be stopped at once. And what I say to people is, don't stop today. Don't stop tomorrow. You've got to go home and seriously assess the kitchen cupboards. Seriously assess the fridge and the freezer. And then you've got to make those adjustments and then start. Otherwise it's too hard. You come home, you're hungry, open the fridge, bread, pasta, everything that you actually don't want to eat. And did you know that hunger is the strongest urge in the human body? And so some of your senses go out the window and you just want to eat. You see that? So it's a good idea to make the changes before you actually take the step. So that's one of the reasons why dairy causes so many problems up in the respiratory, because of the excess mucus that it creates. Did you know in China, tonsillitis was unheard of? Adenoids going out, unheard of. And now, in the last 20 years, the Time magazine says that China's now eating the meat-sweet diet. What's the meat-sweet diet? Very typical to the typical Australian or American diet, which is a lot of meat, a lot of dairy, a lot of sugars, a lot of refined things. Do you know those Chinese children are now getting tonsillitis, adenoids, eczema, asthma, things that were not known of, hardly. And yet now that these are being introduced. And when you think of it, how many Americans have cereal and toast for breakfast, sandwiches for lunch, coffee with tea, coffee with milk, tea with milk and sugar and biscuits. You know, I think the Australian and the American diet in many ways are similar. Now, Australians settled mostly from England, Scotland, but we really have taken on the American way of eating. See, we used to have, and still in many places have, little towns, but I notice in America you have these big shop malls, don't you? Well, Australia's starting to do that as well. So these foods are just so easy, they're just there. So that's one main allergen, is the dairy. So why is wheat an allergen? Well, in the 1950s, Dr. Norman Bullag and a team of scientists put wheat through intensive crossbreeding, and they did it to produce a plant with a higher yield. It was to save the starvation crisis somewhat. You see, traditionally wheat always grew that high, but if you look at wheat today, you know how high it grows? It only grows that high. You see, they got it with a high yield, but before the grain was ready to harvest, the stalk would break and they would lose their grain. Back to the drawing board. Now that they now have a plant that only grows this high and has a thick stem, and it can hold the heavy yield. So 1969, Dr. Norman Bullag got a Nobel Prize for his hybridized wheat. 1970s, this wheat went worldwide. Oh, and how the farmers love it. Sometimes 10 times more grain per acre. What does that mean for the farmer? 10 times more money per acre. They've got to pay their bills. So no wonder they love it. So let's have a look at what's happening by the 1990s. This is in America, in Australia. Let's have a look at what's made out of the wheat. So you've got cereal. You've got bread. You've got cookies. And in America you have biscuits. They're like a roll, is that right? In Australia, biscuits are cookies. So I'll say biscuit because I think I drive along and I see it says biscuits and gravy, so we think biscuits and gravy? To us that's like cookies and gravy, but it's like scones, like a scone, okay. Donuts, I think that's how you spell it. Donuts and pizza. Now Australians love their pies. I think you have pies too, yeah? Pies, yeah. So pies. Another is pasta. So they're crackers. And pretzels too, yeah? We don't have many pretzels. So can you see that a large part of the American diet is made up of this hybridized wheat? So the wheat that God made originally was called Encorn. And Encorn wheat has a very fragile protein or gluten structure. Now that fragile protein or gluten structure is very important because it means that in the grinding process, in the cooking process, in the chewing process, in the enzymes in the gut, it is easily broken down. And it is not sure when, a couple of thousand years ago, a wild grass did a field hybrid with the Encorn and came up with the Emma form of wheat. And this Emma form of wheat is not as fragile as the Encorn, but still fairly fragile. Then in the 1950s, this Emma wheat was put through intensive crossbreeding and came up with a hybridized wheat. What was never addressed was the effect of that hybridized wheat on the human body. No one objects to more grain coming so the farmers can pay their bills and more grain coming to help with the starvation crisis. But what was never addressed was the effect of that grain on the human body. It created an incredibly complex protein or gluten structure, and almost only a cast iron gut can break down that complex structure. So you look at the time frame, worldwide in the 70s, by the 1990s, this is all the hybridized wheat. I've got a friend who's a physician. She said, Barbara, 40 years ago you never heard of gluten intolerance, notice? Even 20 years ago you didn't hear of much. But today it is so common, isn't it? So many people. All you have to do is to go into a section in the supermarket and look at gluten-free. It's huge. And of course, all the supermarkets have on their shelves are what the public demands. Is that right? There's so many people with the gluten intolerance. It's almost only a cast iron gut that can break that down. And so when the gut can't break it down, again, partially digested molecules are getting into the blood. It increases the mucus coming in the eustachian tubes and lining the gastrointestinal tract are villi. And over the gastrointestinal tract is a thick mucosa wall, and it's made up of Lactobacillus acidophilus. You've heard of those friendly bacteria. Now the cells that line this gut are remade every 3 to 5 days. They're made here, they travel up, and away they go. But if a person has had antibiotics, that knocks off the gut flora. I think we all know that. And if a person is on the statin drugs, those cholesterol lowering drugs, that knocks it off. If a person is on cortisone, that knocks it back. If they're on a lot of painkillers, that knocks it back. And I know it's been in the news a lot lately, how many deaths in America a year to opiates? A lot of Americans, it's no different in Australia either, are becoming addicted to the over-the-counter pain-killing medication. So this cell lining the gut is a very happy cell because it's nourished by the gut flora. This cell here is a very unhappy no, sorry, it's got gut flora here. This cell here is a very unhappy one. There's no gut flora to nourish it. Now when dairy and wheat break down in the gut and the enzymes aren't breaking it down efficiently, the wheat breaks down to glutamorphine. And the dairy breaks down to caseomorphine. Now what's morphine? It's an opiate derivative. So this is caseomorphine and this is glutamorphine. Let's follow the journey of glutamorphine. It comes here to the happy cell, and because it's well nourished and working well, it can knock off the morphine so only gluto gets in. Same with the caseo. It can knock off the morphine so only caseo gets in. So that person can handle the wheat and the dairy a little better. But if the caseomorphine and the glutamorphine come here, that undernourished cell cannot knock off the morphine. So glutamorphine and caseomorphine are getting into the blood, going to the brain. The opiate receptor sites pick it up, and there are several books showing the link between mental illness and these foods today. Whoa. Now can you see we've got a couple of problems there? One problem is this difficult to digest foods. Another problem is a breakdown in gut flora, because unfortunately we are a highly medicated society today, aren't we? Now I'm not here to bear all bad news. There is a remedy, and the remedy is to build up that gut lining. You know, Hippocrates, the father of medicine, he said all disease begins in the gut. So how do we build the gut? How to build the gut is to take probiotics. And probiotics can come in and build up that nice gut lining. Also aloe vera. And you can get quite nice aloe vera bottles of juice. You just check the ingredients. You don't want sugar, but you can sometimes get it in apple juice. Not a bad idea to give the family a dose of that 3/4 of an hour before breakfast, and then a little bit of aloe vera juice before breakfast. That certainly helps. They help to build up the gut lining. And there's another herb that helps, and that's slippery elm. And as the name implies, when you put water with it, it goes a bit slippery. So really it's that one or that one, because they both coat, soothe, heal and line the gastrointestinal tract. So that's building the gut. But to build the gut, you also must stop what irritates. So these three here must be stopped. Now before I show you alternatives to those, because that's the good news, there is. Let me just show you a little bit more about the hybridised wheat. If that hybridised wheat is made into a sourdough bread, the culturing process in the sourdough can break down that gluten structure and make it a little bit more fragile. You can still get natural wild hybrids from the Emma wheat. It's called spelt. You may have heard of it. In fact, I think in America you can still buy the Enkhorn. If you search, you can still get that Enkhorn wheat. In fact, there's a book called Enkhorn, and it's about a woman whose little girl had asthma and eczema and so sick. She went to doctor after doctor after specialist who had a whole range of drugs for her, but she looked at the side effects and she thought, if my little girl takes this, what's her future? And then she noticed that whenever she had pasta or whenever she had bread, she'd always cry from the sore tummy and her symptoms would be worse. So she began to investigate the wheat, and she discovered what I have shown to you this evening, that it was hybridized. And she discovered you could still get Enkhorn. So her book is called Enkhorn. And she gives her story, her daughter's story, and she started to give her daughter Enkhorn. But do you remember what I initially said? How long does it take before you see the full effects? 2 months. It's not quick. It's not quick. But you know, the Bible says in Galatians 6 verse 9, let us not be weary in well-doing, for in due season we will reap if we faint not. Just keep going. You will eventually get the results. It's like a husband and wife in their late 30s came to a health retreat from Saudi Arabia. His story was fascinating. He'd had eczema from a child. And when I looked at his history, yes, tonsils out, that's typical of a wheat dairy intolerance as a child. Yeah, adenoids out. Eczema as a child, so he was given cortisone. And cortisone, put it on and it goes away. But where does it go? Have you ever asked yourself? Further in, and guess what? It's going to come out again one day. And here he was in his mid-30s with cortisone-induced eczema. So the very cream that he was taking to heal, it did give a little bit of relief, but it was actually feeding his eczema. And he found a website, Cortisone-Induced Eczema, and there's a German doctor that resides over this. And the answer is, stop the cortisone. And they warn you, 3 months of suffering. You're going to go through sheer hell. Whatever it takes, live in the bath. And by the time he came to us, it was 4 months, so the worst was over. And he had little tiny outbreaks, just a little here and there, bit red, bit itchy. Back of his neck was like crocodile skin. He did 2 weeks with us, and from his history, I could see he had a gluten and a dairy intolerance, but no one had ever told him that. After 2 weeks, at the end of the 2 weeks, he and his wife sat in front of me. They were Asian. They said, "We have to be honest with you, we're disappointed." I smiled. I said, "I understand." But I said, "It'll be about 2 months. You have to wait for 2 months for it to get out of your body. I understand." 6 weeks later, so what's that exactly? 2 months. I get an email, "Gone! All the itchy spots gone. Back of his neck, all gone." They came back to our retreat 1 year later, and you couldn't wipe the smile off their face for the whole program. His skin was, you know, as mine, not a mark. He said to me, "My specialist told me I would never be free of it." He said, "My specialist's children have eczema." What's the old saying? Physician, heal thyself. Do you know, I believe we all should be our own doctors, because only we know how we feel, only we know what we've been through, and only we know how our body responds or reacts to what's happening in our body. So try it, and what does the Bible say in 1 Thessalonians 5:21? "Prove all things and hold fast to that which is good." And that's why it's important to know, write it on the calendar when you stop, and then give it a good 2 months to see the full results. Now, the 2 books you might be interested that talk about wheat and mental illness is Gut and Psychology, and it's by Dr. Natasha Campbell McBride. Gut and Psychology.
Yes.
Gut. It's probably my accent, yeah? Yeah, I even say tomatoes, you say tomatoes. So Gut and Psychology, in fact it's often called the GAP diet. The other book is Grain Brain, and by a neurologist named Dr. David Pertmuller. Pertmuller, I think. Grain Brain by Dr. David Pertmuller. Now, he quotes psychiatrists in his books who are taking their schizophrenic patients off wheat and getting a 50% improvement. Can you see it's not just the wheat, it's also the gut? So I find when people are sick, there's a few threads that come together. It's just not that, and it's just not that. And some say, how can it be wheat? Because that guy's all right on wheat. Well, he must have a strong gut. And you possibly find he doesn't eat that much. Once you stop the wheat, once the symptoms go, maybe in a year or so, you can have a little now and then. But as you can see by the list, Americans just overdo the wheat. And we should never overdo one article of food. That also contributes to building up an allergy to it. What's also happening is in America and Australia, a lot of the wheat is grown with superphosphate. That locks up the minerals in the soil and prevents the plant getting the minerals it needs, so that when you eat that food, you should have the enzymes to help break it down.
Is that the same with organic?
No, with organic they don't grow in superphosphate. But you can get organic hybridized wheat and you still have a problem there. But in fact they're often called ancient grains. So I'll give an asterisk to the ancient grains is Enkhorn, and if you search it you can still get it. There's also spelt and kamut. These are all natural or field hybrids from the original wheat. And teff is another one. Someone told me of another one the other day, but I can't remember what it was. But they're often considered ancient grains. Now, the spelt, kamut and teff, they have this similar fragile structure to the emmer wheat. Not as fragile as the Enkhorn, but if all of these are made into a sourdough bread, that can bring that structure back to the original very fragile structure, because sourdough bread, it's just a way to make the bread, and traditionally all bread was sourdough. 100 years ago, all bread was sourdough. The reason why they extracted the yeast out and just have yeast bread is because they didn't want to wait all night for the bread to rise. But yeast bread will rise in half an hour and they can actually get it, you know, bake it and do it very quickly. Yeah?
The sourdough bread in the stores have yeast in it? Is that
Yeah.
still considered okay?
No. And I'll tell you why. Because the yeast is so strong it'll kill the sourdough. You see, the sourdough culture is a combination of wild yeast and lactobacillus. And what happens is the wild yeast causes the bread to rise, and the lactobacillus consumes the waste from the wild yeast. So you can eat sourdough bread hot out of the oven, but you can't eat yeast bread hot out of the oven, or everyone's going to go around with stomach pains. When you eat sourdough bread, it's almost like you're eating pre-digested grain. Now, when you first start making your spelt or your kamut or teff bread, my suggestion is make it with half wholemeal and half white spelt. It'll make it a little lighter. And it's not bleached like white wheat flour. And by the way, the bleach that bleaches the flour white, they're finding today that it kills off the beta cells in the pancreas. There's always an effect, isn't there? Yes?
You said half wholemeal?
Wholemeal spelt. So when you first start making it, do half wholemeal and half white spelt. It'll make it a little bit lighter. And you've got to win the family with delicious bread.
When you say wholemeal, you mean whole grain, essentially?
That's right. That's right. In fact, if you make your bread with half white, half whole meal or whole grain spelt, it's still better than anything you can buy. What I endeavoured to do was give you an understanding as to why these things are causing allergies. Yeah?
What about the herbicides they use on wheat? Or they use in the field before the wheat's planted?
That's true. The superphosphate in the soil to make the plant grow, and the herbicides and insecticides also are having an effect. That is true. It's almost like that. That's another one. That's another one again. But I tell you this because even organically grown, wholemeal, stone ground, sourdough, wholemeal bread still has that more complex structure. So ideally you go to organic spelt made sourdough. And most health food shops you find will sell the spelt sourdough. And there is a website. It's called www.simpleneeds. And this man, his name is Tristan, and he's a friend of my daughter's. And he makes the most beautiful sourdough bread. And I think he's in Idaho, and he will ship anywhere. Yeah. He makes the nicest gluten-free bread I have ever tasted. You can get some very nice gluten-free bread and some not very nice gluten-free bread. Yes?
What about Ezekiel bread?
What about Ezekiel bread? That's a very good question, because Ezekiel bread is sprouted wheat grain. Now, even though that wheat is still this hybridized wheat, because it's sprouted, it's basically just about brought back to a plant. So the sprouting process greatly breaks down that gluten structure. But a lot of people, especially with delicate digestions, find it a very heavy bread. So the bottom line is, how does it sit with you? But if you have an allergy and you are wanting to test whether you have an allergy to these three, I initially would even stop that.
You said you would stop?
Yeah. Now the good news is you can get some cereals made out of other grains. You can get breads made out of these other grains. In fact, you can get just about anything made out of the other grains. Always be cautious to read the labels on gluten-free because sometimes they're highly refined and got a lot of sugar in them. As I said, there's some great gluten-free breads and some not so great. So some people will taste the gluten-free one that's not good and say, oh, I hate gluten-free bread. And I say, but you haven't tasted them all. And the other is, consider life without bread. Huh? Eat rice. You know, eat more legumes. You know, fill up on vegetables, other things. Yes?
I have a question about sourdough starter. I've tried it with the spelt, but I could not get it to make the starter.
Okay. Yeah, I can't comment on that because we have done it. Maybe your starter needs a little time. Sometimes starters go dormant for a little while. But I do know that one of the ladies that lives on our property, she makes her starter always on rye. She says to me that the starter seems to love the rye. Now, rye has a little gluten in it. And if someone's celiac, often they can't even handle the rye. But if they only are slightly intolerant, they often can handle the rye. And often rye bread has wheat in it. So you have to investigate your labels. The other grain that has a little bit of gluten in it is barley. Now some people who are gluten intolerant can handle oats, but some cannot. The gluten in the oats is a totally different structure to the one that is in the wheat. Some people have said to me, oh, I always get bloating. I say, what do you have for breakfast? And they say to me, oats. I said, well, try no oats for a while and see what happens. So there's a little bit of you, as your own doctor, feeling your way with this. It's a good idea to make a bit of a food diary and say you have breakfast. Now you do an assessment. 10 out of 10 is, my stomach feels fantastic. 1 out of 10 is, oh, I've got to go back to bed. So, or, you know, the other way round. So it can be a very short diary. It doesn't have to be pages long, and you can use those little numbers. And often, weeks later, you can look back and you go, oh, and you can start to see a little bit of a pattern and say, actually, my stomach was much better on the millet. Millet makes a nice porridge. You buy hulled millet. But just remember, you've got to put 3 cups of water with millet. And if you serve the family a millet porridge with stewed apple, or you call it apple sauce, and coconut cream, and maybe a sweet cashew cream with chopped fruit on top and sprinkled with chia seed, you'll win them. Makes delicious breakfast. So what I'll do now is I'll make a list of your totally gluten-free grains. So your gluten-free grains are buckwheat. And buckwheat actually isn't from the grain family, it's from the seed family. And a nice way to get used to buckwheat is buckwheat pancakes. Millet. When you buy millet, buy hulled. Because you can cook millet with the hull on for 2 weeks and it'll still be crunchy. And you don't have budgies, do you? We have budgies in Australia. They're little birds, and you always give them millet, and they put it in their mouth and they throw the hull away and eat the kernel. Millet quinoa, spelt quinoa. That makes a nice breakfast. It's almost like a rice, and nice with applesauce and coconut cream and chopped fruit all the way over it. And it also makes a very nice base for tabbouleh. Now usually tabbouleh, that Lebanese parsley dish, is made with cracked wheat. That's very nice with made with quinoa. Amaranth. Amaranth is a grain that's not very well known, but it is gluten-free, so it's becoming popular. And when you cook it up, it goes like a lump of glue. It's not very nice. But you might do 3/4 millet and 1/4 amaranth. You might do 3/4 quinoa and 1/4 amaranth. You can play around with it a bit. Buckwheat's a very strong flavour. The Polish love it, but a lot of Americans and Australians aren't used to it. So if my grandchildren come, because they love a porridge for breakfast, I will do 3/4 millet and 1/4 buckwheat, and it's quite nice through it like that. So these are your totally gluten-free grains. Now there is another grain that traditionally farmers only ever grew for the cows. But now they're growing it for human consumption because it's gluten-free, and it's sorghum. I think that's how it's spelled. And corn is a gluten-free grain too. But it's pretty important, yes, rice is, to get non-GMO corn. Yep, rice is also gluten-free. So as you can see, you only have to stop one, and there's a whole lot you can eat. And the reason why this is so popular, because of the gluten in it, it makes a very elastic bread and cookies, and they all hold together. Because they have no gluten, it's difficult to make bread out of it, or it'll all just fall apart. So Tristan, who has made a very nice gluten-free bread, I think he puts flaxseed or chia or something in it to make it stick together. And this also is why these are more popular, because they do have a little bit of gluten in them, but it has a less complex protein structure. Yes?
What about, is barley gluten-free?
Barley has a little bit of gluten in it. Yes?
You can also put tapioca starch or tapioca flour. It helps.
That's true. Tapioca starch or tapioca flour can go in bread to bind it together. So there are a few things you can use binders because they don't have the gluten in them. So there, as you can see, there's quite a lot of alternatives to the wheat. What about alternatives to the dairy? Do you know we're the only creature past babyhood that drinks milk? And if people say to me, what milk do you drink, Barbara? I say, I'm weaned. I've got teeth. I eat food. But people like having a little bit of cream on an apple pie, so you can do coconut cream. But didn't the FDA say on a social media in June that it's now understood that coconut isn't as healthy as they thought it was? In fact, it's quite dangerous. Did you read that? Does that mean you quickly go to the South Pacific Islands and say, stop eating the coconut? And they've been eating it for thousands of years. And they had fine health until white man brought this over. Huh? And now they're overweight and they've got eczema and asthma and all the allergies. Yeah? Things that they never even heard of. So your coconut cream, or in Australia we call it cream, but here I think you call it milk. And you can make some very nice cashew milks. I'm sure Cynthia and Naomi can show you how to make delicious cashew creams, cashew milks. Also almond. So that's why a blender's good. So that's what you can use to make your cereal nice. You can use soy milk as long as it's non-GMO. If it's non-GMO or organic, it's safe. But you really can't touch any other type of soy. Yes?
The pasta, it always says semola.
Semolina. I think it's semolina. That's from wheat. And couscous is from wheat. So you have to really read your labels. But I know my daughter lives in Wisconsin and she gets a very nice brown rice macaroni. So you've got Sprout and Whole Foods and Trader Joe's. They have a great range of gluten-free pastas. So
there's actually a brown rice quinoa pasta that is very good as well.
Brown rice quinoa pasta.
You can get it at Aldi's.
Okay, brown rice quinoa pasta that you can even get at Aldi's. You know why? Because there's so much gluten intolerance. What are the symptoms of a gluten intolerance? How long's a piece of string? But the two most common are brain fog and bloating. And how many people have that? And how many people are blaming age?
Not everybody.
Not everyone?
Not everybody.
Yeah, about everyone. That's true. A lady said to me one day she got asthma, had asthma as a child. So I always put my detective hat on to find out why these things are so. I said, when did you first have asthma? Now, if a person says to me they had it as a child, then I then say, what were you fed? And if it's cow's milk, that's a common cause. Most formulas are cow's milk. So if a baby did have asthma or eczema, what would you give them? Goat's milk. Goat's milk is very similar to human milk. But this lady said to me at the age of 5. So then my question was, what happened at 5? She said, we moved into another house and we kids were fascinated with this house. There were mushrooms growing in the carpet in the corner of the lounge room. So what are those children breathing in? Yeah, see, whenever you get respiratory problems, I like to use the process of elimination. And these are common causes. And if the child is breastfed, the mother has to stop the wheat, dairy, refined sugar. And if the mother doesn't want to stop the wheat, dairy and refined sugar, she will need to put the baby on goat's milk. But if after 2 months we've still got a problem, then you've got to investigate more. And one mother told me she pulled her baby's cot out one day and all behind it was black mould. And then there was another family with twin boys. One little boy was rushed to hospital almost once a week. And they were just beside themselves. Because what happens when they go to hospital? Then they're put on medication and then you got the effect of that. So they got someone into the home and they pulled the beds out and behind this twin's bed was all black mould under the carpet. Whereas the other twin in the other corner, there was no mould there. And sometimes it can be a dripping tap behind the wall. Sometimes it can be a leaking moisture from an air conditioner. And sometimes it can be guttering that's all chocked up with leaves and not, you know, you got to, that's why we've all got to be private investigators, investigating why these things are so. So these are the most common things that are causing allergens, but also mold can be a factor and also chemicals can be a factor. So that's the other thing that one must check. And what you'll often find is when a person has allergies and are reacting, and they get to the point where they react to just about anything, it could be that their cup is full, you know, their body's full. That's chemical sensitivity. Maybe it's some mold, some chemicals, some allergies, you know. And how many children have bad asthma as a child? They're given a lot of antibiotics, the gut flora is taken away. You see the vicious cycle? And then all you have to do is have one more drop come in and you get overflow. And that's when you get the bad reactions. So what do you got to do? You've got to assess the home. You know, that if one of the members of the family smoke, it's got to be outside the house. Got to check that there's no chemicals. If you live in an area where all the fields around you are being sprayed, you really have to look at moving. And then you have to look at mold. Is there any mold in the basement? You've got to check all of these things out. And eliminate these foods and start to build up the gut. The body's very reliable. It's an incredible organism. It's got an inbuilt ability to heal itself. But it has to be given the right conditions. So the good news is, even today, in 2017, we can live a happy, healthy life if we give the body the right conditions. Some of the other symptoms of a gluten and a dairy intolerance can be eczema, can be asthma, can be tonsillitis, can be irritable bowel syndrome, can be constipation. Can you see why? That's why I said how long's a piece of string? Sinus, that's another one. So you see that there can be many, yes?
What about the ears?
Yeah, the ears. Now that's your eustachian tubes and sleep apnea machines. The eustachian tubes are all blocked off. So when children have recurrent ear infections, that stop that. And many children would not need grommets if they were just taken off that. Yeah?
What about the orange juice? I've heard some people say about orange juice affecting the ears.
Oranges?
Orange juice.
Orange juice. It certainly can. In fact, in his book, The Body's Many Cries for Water, Dr. Batman Geheldich, he's an Indian doctor, he says if someone has asthma or eczema, don't give them orange juice. That can be an allergen. But can you see, it just can be one of many. And if all of that was down here, they might be able to handle orange juice. That's why I say if you stop all of these things in a year, you might be able to go out for a meal and have a bit of wheat pasta at a restaurant and it won't react. But you've got to give the body time to get all of this out of the system, build up and can be strong again, and then you might be able to handle it. Yes?
I found that fasting, even for just one full day, and also drinking a lot of water instead of food, both of those tend to reduce my overload.
That's true. That's true. In fact, what the gentleman said, that when you fast, you can get this down. And of course, the best way to clean the dishes is water, and the best way to wash the clothes is water, and the best way to clean the body is water. So that is true. Or you can book into Living Springs and do a detox. We're all jealous of these people up the back who have just done 2 days of juicing, and tomorrow's a very exciting day because solid food is coming. So that is true. In fact, it's been used for centuries, and that's how you can get those levels down, is the detoxing, the detoxification process. And our lifestyle guests are very relieved because it was a little bit hard watching all you people eat. But tomorrow is coming. Are there any questions before we close?
I wonder if there's a link in dairy, wheat, sugar to obesity, for example. You know,
Yeah.
and maybe even the way the body reacts to those things. I'm thinking, I'm the oldest of 14 first cousins.
Whoa.
And 11 of those first cousins are morbidly obese.
Yeah.
Okay?
Now, there's a book that you can read up on this, because what you say is absolutely right, and I didn't pursue that tonight because I'm pursuing allergies. But it's called Wheat Belly by Dr. William Davis, and on just about every page of the book he says wheat belly. Yeah. Because what was also changed in the hybridization process was the structure of the starch, and it actually gets the blood sugar level up higher than sugar. So it's one of the biggest contributing factors to diabetes and obesity today is the wheat. So an easy way to lose weight is to stop the carbs, stop the wheat carbs. So that's another nice side effect of making this change, is shedding the excess pounds.
Well, we started 2 weeks ago on a strictly vegetarian diet, no bread, no sugar, no wheat products.
Yep, yep.
And now
So-
I lost 9 pounds. And
That's great. It's
the first week, I have to tell you, my body was had a hard time adjusting.
See, that had a hard time adjusting because the wheat gets the blood sugar level up higher than sugar, it's addictive. And when you stop the addictions, what's going to happen?
But the second week's been great.
Yeah, the second week. So this was a divine appointment, yeah? Hearing this information 2 weeks into your eliminating those food. But I also have to remind you, and I think that you can identify with this, a lot of people stop meat and go on wheat. Yeah. Is that right? Yes. They stop the meat and go on the pasta and the bread, and they think, I've become a vegetarian and I'm worse. And when I look at what they've done, I say, no wonder. But many are sick through ignorance. And that's why I quote these books to you, and I'm very thankful to God for these doctors who have written these books. They've got decades of clinical practice up their sleeve, and they're blowing the whistle. There's a book called Serial Killer. This is how the cereal, by Alan Watson. And he shows in there that the grain and the cereal industries go to court and defend their right to brainwash our children to eat more cereal, more cookies, more bread. That's pretty bad, isn't it? Yeah?
I had a book called 5-Day Rotation Diet by, I think Mandel wrote it. And I guess what that does, it doesn't tell you to stop eating things, but it's not at first. But you keep going on this 5-day rotation where you have totally different foods every day, and then you begin to see what affects you.
That is true. A rotation diet where you have different foods every day and you start to see. But can you see the problem with the wheat is it takes 2 months before you see the full result.
But it would reduce your overload though.
It would reduce your overload, and many people that start on the wheat-free diet, they're actually getting results fairly quickly. The bloating stops, the brain fog starts to clear, but the full results can take 2 months, like with the guy that had the eczema. You had a question?
I know someone that has a child that has seizures and they can't figure out what's causing the seizures. And so I told them that I was coming here and I would ask you if you've heard of any link to seizures and allergies. Yes.
And there is a book about that.
Okay.
And it's Stop Autism Now, and it's by Dr. Bruce Fife, F-I-F-E. And one of the chapters in the book is called The Ketone Miracle. And I know in Johns Hopkins Hospital they still do the ketogenic diet, which is drastically stopping all the carbohydrates, so that's absolutely wheat out, and supplementing with the coconut oil.
Did you say eliminating coconut oil?
No, supplementing with the coconut oil. Because the liver breaks down the medium chain fatty acids in coconut oil to ketones, and ketones are neurohealers, neuroprotectors. But that book, Stop Autism Now, is not just about autism, it's about all childhood neurodegeneration, including epilepsy.
What was the author's name?
Dr. Bruce Fife, F-I-F-E. It's an American book. We sell it, but we have to get it from America, so it'll be easier for you to get. In fact, in his book, he says there's almost no need to mention it because it's so well known. First of all, stop the dairy, wheat and refined sugar. He said autistic children will have a 50% improvement once that's stopped.
And you know, many families with autistic children feed them highly processed food. I've seen this over and over.
That's right, that's right. And there's a book, Jenny MacArthur, I think she's an American actress. She conquered her child's autism, and her story is quoted in that book, Stop Autism Now. By the age of 3, he was virtually past it, and she stopped the wheat. Have you heard this before? Stopped the wheat, dairy, refined sugar. He also boosted his B12 a little bit and put him on an antifungal diet. See, every time he got a sniffle, she'd put him on antibiotics because if he got a fever, he'd start to have seizures. So he had a yeast presence in his body too. So they're the three things that turned her child around. She said every now and then you see a little bit of this, which is a typical autism, but he was basically conquered. So that's impressive too, very impressive. So you see, we're not just talking about allergies, this thing's big. And as you can see, I've had an hour to talk to you, and I have talked to you for an hour, but I think I've also tipped the iceberg. And that's why I give you these books, so you can explore these different things a little bit more. My aim was to whet your appetite and to get you inquisitive to find out these things. Yes?
The concern about Candida albicans, for instance, this is, the Candida is fertilized by these foods that you believe we should eliminate. Is that what you're saying?
That's right. They feed Candida, all of these. But Candida albicans is naturally occurring in every human gut. In fact, there are dozens of different species of Candida. It's only when it takes over. That's why healing the gut, taking the probiotic, the aloe, stopping these foods and bringing back the balance. Your body will naturally bring it under control. That's the good news. Well, thank you for your attention tonight. It's been, thank you.